Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Lewicki. Putin's regime has announced a fast-track procedure for the seizure of Western assets in retaliation to Europe's plans to use frozen Russian money to fund Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. Yet Europe itself is still struggling to thrash out a specific plan, with Belgium's Prime Minister voicing his concerns over the legal framework for such a move. Can Europe afford to spend yet another year arguing over details where Ukraine's economy continues to struggle and support from the US may be about to dwindle? Joining us here today is Kinga Redłowska, Director of the Center for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute Europe. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So Vladimir Putin is threatening nationalization, but it's about private companies. Some say these companies are in Russia because they want to be there. And so we're not to blame for their conduct.
Vladimir Putin announced a decree that is a fast track to privatization of foreign-owned companies that continue to operate in Russia. And Jonasz, you are right, there are many Western companies that continue to operate in Russia. And after more than 3 years, they've generated an abundant income and revenue, with the benefit also to Kremlin because they are paying taxes in Russia and therefore fueling state budget. And these companies include financial institutions such as Raiffeisen, but also consumer giants such as Mondelez.
So massive companies there deciding to stay, taking the risk, and now apparently is going to be karma for them. Nevertheless, we're also looking at how Europe is going to go about it, because we've been hearing about possible seizure of assets for quite a while now. We were expecting some details to emerge in Copenhagen, but what we got instead is more discussions and more doubts.
Yes and no. We hear more discussions, but there is a momentum building on Russian frozen assets. And the momentum is triggered by a shift in German stance on this issue. So Chancellor Merkel put forward a very bold proposal to make use of total value of Russian frozen assets as a zero interest loan to Ukraine. With the condition that the funds will be spent in Europe on European military equipment. So in this concept, we support both Ukraine, but also European defense industry. And European Commission says that the concept is legally sound, as this loan will be guaranteed collectively by all 27 member states.
Well, we also have Belgian Prime Minister Bart De Wever voicing his doubts, his concerns, and essentially he said that the question is, can we eat the chicken? Because if we eat the chicken, we're not going to get the golden eggs. So can we, should we eat that Russian chicken that we have here? And also, who's benefiting the most from the golden eggs? Because some people suggest it is not Ukraine.
Well, so what Chancellor Merz proposed is actually not the confiscation, but securing the loan that will make full use of those assets. And so we are not eating the chicken, we are conditioning, there are conditions put forward by Chancellor Merz in order for the money to go back straight to Moscow. And these conditions are that the Russian aggression is stopped and the war ends, and secondly, that Russia pays reparations to Ukraine. And Chancellor Merz says when these conditions are met, money, the frozen assets, will go straight to Moscow.
Perhaps knowing that Russia will never pay these reparations, right?
Well, they will or they will not. Let's hope they will pay reparations to Ukraine in accordance with international law. But we all know that the amounts that Russia will need to pay Ukraine are much larger than the frozen assets of the Russian central bank.
So do you think that Putin is expecting for the directors, the CEOs, the shareholders of all those Western companies which are still present in Russia, to act as inadvertent lobbyists, essentially trying to, tried to get in touch with their MPs, with members of the European Commission, saying, look, before you proceed with the Russian assets, know that there are jobs at stake and all that. Do you think that this is what he is actually hoping for?
Well, he is hoping to weaken the consensus and political will in the EU to act more aggressively on Russian assets. And let's look into what has been happening in Russia so far. So since 2022, Kremlin already confiscated $50 billion of foreign assets. And those companies, those assets are usually resold to fuel state budget. But so far, Vladimir Putin tried to avoid an outright nationalization, and very often he put those companies under temporary management to later sell those companies to Russian or Kremlin-friendly buyers.
So but more legal trickery there, right?
Yes, but the trend is clear. Companies that continue to operate in Russia face legal, financial and reputational risks. And those companies that left Russia just after full-scale invasion, they got better deals, they sometimes got very favorable buyback options, but by now they found new buyers and new supply chains. So those companies that made decision to stay, they need to face the risk. And frankly, Jonas, staying in Russia and operating in Russia is not as a strategic move. It's a liability for a company. The longer you stay, the higher price you will pay.
And the exposure increases. I mean, it's a kind of like, I told you so kind of situation. Speaking of, the Russian budget, because clearly they're looking for new sources of revenue, do you think it is quite as stable as the Kremlin is trying to pretend that it is? Or is it as brittle as some analysts are suggesting? Because we have so many different signals there, right?
It's something in between. Russian economy is struggling. It's increasingly turning into a war-driven economy, with the defense industry being a massive base of generating the revenue.
Is it sustainable?
No, it's not sustainable, because Russian economy is not investing in innovation. It's basically buying modern technologies from countries such as China to circumvent European sanctions, but it has been cut off from innovation and from high-quality goods, and the drain of human resources that we've seen since the Russian full-scale invasion also impacts the quality and potential of this economy.
So it's a long-term problem, right? But what about short-term? Because what we really would like to see is for this economy to not be able to, generate profits and to fuel its own war machine. And in this regard, how much do you think we can rely on the strikes in refineries? Because again, there are different voices there. Some people say, okay, this is going to make it more difficult, but it's not going to lead to an outright collapse or to, scaling back the plans for the war.
It's never realistic to look for a collapse of the economy, an immediate impact. What we are looking for is to steadily, consistently undermine those resources. And you rightly point to energy as the biggest revenue that is fueling Russian war machine. And so attacking the refineries, but also strict secondary sanctions imposed mainly by the US on countries that are buying Russian oil, namely China and India, and hopefully more aggressive stance of the EU on those countries, along with cutting buying Russian energy by European consumers and EU countries. This is what we should be aiming for to undermine this massive stream of income for Kremlin.
So that's the idea, but is it going to happen? I mean, the US has pointed out rightly that the European Union, during a specific period after the war started, spent more money buying resources from Russia than aiding Ukraine. But nevertheless, it's also kind of like an exit strategy. Washington can say, well, if you're not going to implement this fast enough, which could be a problem for technical reasons, well, we don't have an obligation to go ahead and, for example, impose crippling sanctions, secondary sanctions on various countries with which we're also negotiating other deals, right? So is this going to lead to some sort of stalemate there potentially?
I don't think so. Europe needs to be more muscular in how it's putting more economic pressure on Kremlin, and there is this strong nudge from Washington now, and so we've heard about the EU officials discussing the next EU package. We've heard it most probably will include a total ban on LNG imports from Russia, phased out to January 2027, but still a total ban. So things are changing and moving forward in the right direction.
Some countries will object though, right?
Well, they object, but in the long run, we need to reach this consensus in light of a dire situation on the military front and, frankly, a direct threat Russia is posing to EU member states.
So about these secondary sanctions, did you expect them to be introduced in the end? We've seen that with India. It's already caused certain problems because, of course, the US was also negotiating with India. But what about China? I mean, this would have been a bold strategic move.
So traditionally, the US has been quite bold in deploying secondary sanctions, and OFAC is quite strong in this deterrence by threatening countries or entities to impose those sanctions. The EU has traditionally opposed this move, but we increasingly hear policymakers in Brussels saying, we need to get stronger, more effective on sanctions, and imposing more anti-circumvention mechanisms and more listings is a way forward.
What about loopholes? I mean, importing uranium from Russia. There were reports by Bloomberg, I think, which confirmed that the US has still been buying uranium from Russia using certain loopholes that were left behind, even though in theory they shouldn't have been doing that, but there were certain provisions like, you know, if it's necessary, you can still buy that. And Rosatom largely was excluded from sanctions until now.
Well, the loopholes, they always exist. It's a constant tug of war. Imposing sanctions and seeing where the loopholes are and responding to those loopholes. Sanctions are never about, cracking down economy. The aim of sanctions is to make it more difficult and slower and more expensive for Russia to purchase certain goods and generate income. And so we need to be diligent, we need to look for those loopholes and address them in our legislation, both here in the EU, but also on the other side of the Atlantic.
Looking at the way Russia is actually referring to its own economy, what signals would you be out for in order to determine whether they really do have problems? Because they will never openly admit that, right? But you could, for example, look at stuff like, reducing military spending, which Putin actually said they will be scaling it back during the next couple of years. Do you think that this is an indication that something is really wrong with that entire system?
Well, scaling down investments or expenditure on defense industry is just engineering, because we know some of those costs are hidden under other budget lines in the Russian state budget. But fundamentally, we've seen Kremlin going after not only foreign-owned companies, but also Russian companies, and is increasingly nationalizing those Russian companies. And then, as I've said, reselling them just to increase the state budget.
Kinga Redłowska was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński, you're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.